Good evening, everyone. Thank you guys for coming out. This is the Hardy Chair Lecture that is hosted by the Department of Sociology, Criminology, and Human Services. I am Dr. LaRose. I am an assistant professor of sociology, and I have invited Dr. Slack here from LSU to be our Hardy Chair guest. There will be sign-in sheets outside of the door if you guys did not sign in for bonus points. Feel free to do that after the lecture at this point. There will also be a Q&A session after the lecture, so please stay, please ask lots of questions. And let's see, so if you guys have any questions, there will be someone, probably me, walking around with a microphone. So President Mullen will be the one to introduce our Hardy Chair.
Thank you very much. I did take the liberty of signing up to see if I could get some bonus points as well. Welcome everyone, and before we introduce the 2025 Hardy Chair speaker, I would like to first thank the Department of Sociology, Criminology, and Human Services, Alpha Phi Sigma's Pi Gamma chapter, the Office of Academic Affairs, as well as everyone who had a hand in putting together this event. A special note of appreciation, of course, should be given to Dr. H. Claude Hardy, who endowed this event. Dr. Hardy's endowment has annually provided a fund that provides funding to bring experts to campus who can connect their research with concerns of our greater community. And I think that is a shining example of the kind of difference that a liberal arts college can make for its community. And thus I'm honored to introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. Tim Slack, Professor of Sociology at the Louisiana State University. Dr. Slack is an expert in the field of social stratification and social demography, often focusing on rural populations and rural-urban differences. He has published extensively with over 60 journal articles, book chapters, and additional publications to his credit. In 2024, with Shannon Monnet of Syracuse University, he published the book Rural and Small Town America, Context, Composition, and Complexities, published by the University of California Press. He frequently delivers research presentations at the meetings of major professional societies and for policy-oriented audiences. For example, the Federal Reserve and the Louisiana legislature. His expertise has also been sought for stories produced by major media outlets such as the New York Times, USA Today, and The Advocate, which is Louisiana's leading daily newspaper. He is the recipient of the LSU Rainmaker Award, the LSU Alumni Association Faculty Excellence Award, and I think most powerfully, LSU's Distinguished Faculty Award. All of these are university-wide honors. This evening, Dr. Slack will present his lecture, Rural and Small Town America, Myths and Misunderstandings. So please join me in welcoming the 2025 Hardy Chair speaker, Dr. Tim Slack. Professor, thank you.
All right, well, thank you for that introduction, Mr. President, and thank you to the Hartwick community for having me come visit, and especially to Jennifer LaRose and her colleagues in sociology, criminal justice, and human services. I've had a very nice time thus far. Participated in a class this morning, which was really nice. Had a very nice lunch with students. And so people have really stepped up and done a great job hosting, and I really appreciate that. I've had a lot of people also apologizing to me for the weather, but I must say, for me, this is exotic. So we don't get cold, snowy weather very often, and so it feels good. In fact, the day that I left, the paper said that the weather was going to be chilly. Okay, the high was 60 degrees. So different place, different standards. I guess it's all relative, right? So what I'm going to talk about tonight is rural and small town America, myths and misunderstandings. And this is really based on some themes that came out of the book that I've recently published with my colleague Shannon Monnet up at Syracuse University. We have cards out front if you're interested. You can grab one for some more information. But the general idea of the book is really looking at the complexities and the variable composition of rural America and what is rural, okay? And digging into many of the misunderstandings that folks often have about rural people and places. Okay, so just as a starting point, I would note that rural America is significant in its size. Okay, the vast majority of the land-mass of the United States is rural in character. I mean, if you think about our land, the population share is significant when you contrast it against urban populations, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. And the social and economic significance of rural America is significant. Okay, in many ways, rural and urban places today are more socially and economically integrated than they've ever been, right? And technological advancements are letting us traverse space in new ways. But we should not discount the social and economic significance. Yet in a mostly urban society, because we are a mostly urban nation, the challenges faced by rural America are often overlooked and or misunderstood, right? There's a lot of sort of conventional wisdoms that operate that either have a kernel of truth, but if you open you look under the hood and dig a little deeper, there's a lot more complexity, or there's also a lot of ideas that folks have that are just wrong about who and what is rural. So this presentation highlights 5 myths and misunderstandings about rural America, and those are related to population loss, employment, the ethno-racial composition of rural America, health, and politics. Okay, and I'll dig into each one of these in turn. As I said before, this presentation's building off of the themes that we raised in Rural and Small Town America. It was published by the University of California Press this past August, and that was exciting. It was the first, published a fair number of articles and book chapters, but this is my first book, so that was exciting. And I had the privilege of working with Shannon Monnet, who's a really well-known sociologist and demographer at Syracuse University. The central thesis of the book is that social change abounds in rural America. Okay? It's often the case that people think about rural people and places as some holdover of a time gone by, right? Of places that don't have the same kind of dynamism that we see in our metropolitan areas. Okay? But the theme that we really try to pull out is that that's absolutely not true, right? Social change abounds in rural America, and it's changing in really important ways. And those changes have implications not just for rural people and places, but for the entire nation. Given the urban-centric tendencies of the U.S., what we try to do is pay empirical attention to the context, composition, and complexities of rural America. And to do that, because so much of our mass media, well, our population, but also our mass media, political dialogues, and so forth, are really urban-centric, right? So what we're trying to do in this book is provide a counterweight. And I should note that the social sciences are urban-centric, and sociology is urban-centric, okay? So what we're trying to do is really provide a counterweight to that and bring to the fore all of the interesting things that matter both from a sociological and social scientific perspective, but also that matter for public policy and so forth. Okay, so one thing to start with is just the basic question of what is rural? And in our book, we draw on two of the major official definitions of what is rural. One thing to note is that both definitions of rurality define rural as the residual, okay? They define rural as that piece that is left over after defining what is urban, okay? So in both cases, you'll see it's this residual category. The Census Bureau defines urban, has an urban-rural definition. The Census Bureau's definition is that urban is densely developed areas with at least 2,000 housing units or 5,000 people. Okay, so it's about density of buildings and residents, okay, meeting a certain threshold. In 2020, 20% of the U.S. population, which translates into about 66 million people, lived in rural areas as defined by the Census Bureau. Another major definition comes from the Office of Management and Budget, or the OMB, and this is the definition of metropolitan and non-metropolitan areas, or metro and non-metro. Metro, this is a county level definition, so the rural urban is a place-based definition based on density. The metro non-metro definition is county or county equivalent based. So for example, in Louisiana where I'm located, we don't have counties, we have parishes, okay, but it's a county equivalent. Metro is counties with an urbanized area of 50,000 or more people, as well as counties that are adjacent to that county that are linked by substantial commuting rates. Okay? In 2020, 14% of the U.S. population, or 46 million people, lived in non-metro counties. To give you an idea, just a local idea, okay, Otsego County is, pronounce it right? All right, Otsego County is a non-metropolitan county, or a non-metro county, right? And Oneonta is an urban area. Okay, so you have a non-metropolitan county with an urban area in it. What this map shows you is metropolitan, metro and non-metro counties and urban areas following the 2020 census. Okay, and so you can see on the map the places that are colored in sort of the yellowish green. Okay, those are non-metro counties. The counties that are gray are metro counties. Okay, and then the little dots in black are urban areas. If we were able to zoom in right on this county, right, it would be colored yellow, right, and then have a few black dots, right, for Oneonta, and I believe there's a few other communities that sort of meet that threshold in the county. Okay, but this gives you an idea, right? And one of the things to note when you look at this is just how much of the space, how much of the landmass of our country, right, fits that non-metro definition. Okay, then of course you can see other places that don't, right? We can see the big corridor, the big metropolitan corridor that basically spans from Boston down to DC, right? We can see places near to me, like Houston and Dallas, right? You can see Atlanta. You can see the Southern California and so forth, right? That stand out. Okay, so myth and misunderstanding number one. In the context of urbanization, isn't rural America just fading away due to population loss? Isn't rural America just a place where the population is shrinking and dwindling away? Aren't we talking about communities that are just sort of fading, right? As young people move away and older folks age in place, right, and move towards the end of their lives. So one of the things I want to bring to the fore is the idea of what we call the demographic paradox, okay? And thinking about population change and the demographic paradox. There's no doubt that urbanization is a dominant demographic trend, okay? If we think about sort of the long arc of history in the United States of America, right? We started as a primarily agrarian, right? Agrarian nation with agriculture at the center, right? Then we begin to go through the Industrial Revolution near the turn of the last century, right? And that pulls people from the countryside into cities, right? From farms to factories, okay? And urbanization has continued, right, over the course of time. So we have become certainly a more urban nation over time, okay? But, and this is the key but, urbanization, for starters, has not been a linear process, okay? That is to say, we have not just steadily become more urban. While we have become more urban over time, we have not done so at a steady rate. There have been periods of time where we have what are called rural rebounds, okay? Probably the most notable one in the last 50 years, 60 years was during the 1970s. There was a major back to the land movement, people actually leaving cities to come to non-metropolitan areas or rural areas. Okay, we had another rural rebound in the first half of the 1990s, okay, when there was also again movement into non-metropolitan places and counties. And more recently, it looks like we have seen another rural rebound related to the COVID-19 pandemic, okay? As people began to both try to leave cities in the density of contact that existed there, but also, right, with so many people that began to have opportunities to work remotely and be less tied to place, right? That allowed people to make that move, okay? There is, of course, now pressure on those folks to move back, right, in many cases. But we saw a rural rebound related to the COVID-19 pandemic. The other thing to note is that how we measure rural and non-metro creates a paradox, okay? And non-metro in particular, most of what I talk about today is actually going to be relying on that non-metro county measure, okay? But measurement creates a paradox. Many rural areas are vibrant and growing, okay? Many non-metropolitan counties are vibrant and growing. But the way that we measure non-metro means that if you have sustained population growth in a place, that will result in reclassification at a certain point. That will lead to reclassification as metro. Okay, so there's a selection bias over time, right? It's the places that either are not growing or are having shrinking populations that tend to stay non-metro, whereas places that are non-metro and grow become metro. Okay, and that paradox often makes it look as if the vibrancy and the growth that it does exist in many places isn't there. Okay, because these places are jumping categories over time. Okay, over the last 50 years, in fact, most metro population growth, most growth in our metropolitan areas has actually been driven not by the growth in the population in existing metros. It's been driven by non-metro to metro reclassification, right? As the footprint of cities has expanded, right, and commuting patterns into metro cores have changed, okay? That's what's been driving growth in our metropolitan populations. Okay, it's that reclassification question. Okay, if we think about population loss and gain, I mean, it is true that many rural places or many non-metro places are losing population. If we look over the period, this last decade from 2010 to 2020, about 2/3 of non-metropolitan counties lost population. They had population decline. Okay, and that's usually due to a combination of young people moving out, right, and older people passing on, right? And of course, when young people move away, they not only leave themselves, but they take their reproductive potential, right? They go and they have children and build families other places, right? So that can lead to the loss, okay? But the flip side of the coin is about 1/3 of non-metropolitan places grew. Okay, so this idea that all of rural America is witnessing population loss is simply not true. If you see on my screen, it's green. It looks sort of more yellow for y'all. Okay, but those are places that grew, right? So you can see growth in the northeastern part of the country, right? Especially in Vermont, where we saw growth. There's lots of growth in the southeastern United States. Okay. There is lots of growth in the Intermountain West. Okay. And in the Northwest, with people really moving to these places and building families in these places. Okay, so the dynamics are regionalized. Okay, but there's important variance there, is the point. The other thing to note is that the really key areas where we see growth is places that are categorized as rural natural amenity destinations. Okay, so this is to say these are places that have characteristics of the natural environment that people are pulled to. Okay, this tends to be temperate climates, woodlands, mountains, water, that sort of thing. Okay, and people are pulled to these places, right? Especially folks that are interested in engaging in outdoor recreation and so forth, right? So, for example, you can see there's a fair amount. Okay, there's a fair amount of growth in the northern Great Lakes region. A lot of people being pulled towards the lakes and the water up there. A lot of growth in the Intermountain West as people are pulled to, especially the Rocky Mountains and the beauty and the recreational opportunities that exist there. Okay, and what this graph on the right shows is the difference across non-metropolitan places in terms of population growth based on a natural amenity measure that the United States Department of Agriculture puts out. Okay, so on the far side, you have places that have very little in the way of the natural amenities that act as a pull for people, right? And then as you go across the x-axis, you have places that have higher and higher natural amenities, right? And what you can see is, yeah, there tends to be loss in the places that have low natural amenities, but there's quite a bit of growth actually over time in high amenity places. Okay. So another myth and misunderstanding. Myth and misunderstanding number 2, rural is synonymous with farming, okay? This is something that you hear all the time if you talk with people in cities, okay? They think that rural America is all farms and that everybody in rural America is a farmer, okay? Bottom line, it's not true, okay? Non-metropolitan employment does depend more on agriculture than it does in non-metro areas, okay? And that stands to reason, right? And certainly we use a fair amount of our land in rural America for agricultural purposes, right? But farms have become much bigger over the course of time, right? The farming enterprise has become much more technologically driven and demands less labor than it used to, okay? So non-metro areas do depend more on agriculture. They do depend more on mining, okay? My part of the country, that mining also includes oil and gas, right? So all of our offshore activity would be captured there. But rural areas also depend more on construction, on manufacturing. And this is something I'm going to stress, okay? Because a lot of times people think about cities and factories, right? But manufacturing is actually a bigger deal for rural America than it is for metropolitan America. Retail, and this is also important in the current context, government, okay? There's a lot of government jobs, okay? And this is government at all levels. So this could be people working for the federal government, the state, but also county and local, okay? The key here is that farming is not synonymous with rural, okay? Less than 10% of non-metro employment nationwide is in agriculture, okay? So the flip side of that coin, of course, is that 90% of the jobs that folks do are in other industries. Okay. Moreover, even among farm families, more than 90% claim off-farm income, right? It's often the case that folks will have off-farm jobs, not just for the added income, but also to gain access to things like retirement systems and pensions and health care, right? And you can see over on the right side of the screen, I've just circled the areas, the parts of the economy where non-metro has a bigger share, right? And actually what you can see is the largest single share is in government, okay? Sometimes rural America is thought to be this place of a real anti-government sentiment, and sometimes it is, okay? The irony, of course, is that it's actually the single largest chunk of jobs. Okay, I want to say a little bit about manufacturing and deindustrialization. We've had a real trend over the last 50 to 60 years towards deindustrialization, right? We moved from being an agrarian nation to an industrial nation, right? We are now in a post-industrial service-based economy, right? And we've seen major job losses in manufacturing, right? This is probably the key region to think about is really that region that stretches from Buffalo over to Milwaukee, right? What that used to be the heart of American industry, steel and cars, right? We now refer to it as the Rust Belt, right? That really kind of captures that deindustrialization trend, okay? And oftentimes when people think about factory work, they think urban, right? They think about that farms to factories, rural to urban movement that we saw in many cases in the 20th century, okay, in the early 20th century. But the reality is today, a greater share of jobs and earnings come from manufacturing in non-metropolitan counties than in metropolitan counties, okay? And you can see that displayed on the right, okay? It's consistently a larger share of jobs and earnings in non-metro areas. It comes from manufacturing, okay? What this means is that the process of deindustrialization, right, where we often think about the major deindustrialized cities, right, like the struggles of Detroit when we think deindustrialization. But deindustrialization as a process has been really, really painful in rural America, okay? And you can think, right, I mean, it's one thing when you lose a manufacturer or a plant in a large and diversified metropolis, right? It's a totally different story when a manufacturer or a plant has been at the center, right, of the economy and the identity of a small town for generations, right? And it goes out, right? When a small town loses that big employer, right, that good jobs employer, it is a real gut punch. Okay, so that's a big part of the story to recognize. And indeed, that's been something that's come up a lot in our national politics over the last few years, right? People feeling the pain of deindustrialization in rural America. Okay. I want to say a few words also about underemployment and falling labor force participation, because these are big concerns in rural America. Okay, the first thing to recognize is that underemployment is consistently higher in non-metropolitan counties. Okay, and underemployment is a measure that includes unemployment, that is, folks that are out of work but actively looking, right? Unemployment is a more narrow definition than people often think, right? I mean, I always joke with my students that everybody's got the uncle, right? That people worry about, and they say, man, that Uncle so-and-so, he's been unemployed for so long, so many years, right? And the reality is Uncle so-and-so is not unemployed, okay? That Uncle so-and-so is not in the labor force, okay? Because you have to be actively looking for work to be in the labor force, okay? The unemployed is people that are out of work but are actively searching, okay? Underemployment also includes discouraged workers, okay? So these are people who would like a job but have given up the job search because they've become so discouraged with their prospects. They've dropped out, okay? So we're bringing them back into the measure here. It also includes involuntary part-time work, right? Or people that are working multiple part-time jobs but would like full-time work. Okay? And it includes people that are working for low wages. So this is working for near poverty level wages, but with full-time hours. Okay? So we're grouping all of them together. And when we do that with underemployment, what you see is that underemployment in non-metropolitan areas consistently exceeds that of metropolitan areas. Okay? So that aspect of employment hardship is a defining feature of rural America. The other thing that I want to bring up here is that prime-age labor force participation, okay, so that is the labor force participation among people in the prime of their working years, typically between 25 and 54, okay, we're seeing that go down in non-metropolitan places, okay, and it's prime labor force, the drop, it's prime labor force participation is lower and falling in non-metropolitan areas. And you can see that on the right, okay, over time, starting with 07, right before the Great Recession of 08, 09, right? It went down to where it was in 2019 and then further down and further, right? So now even among those who are of prime working age, about 73% are in the labor force, okay? And an even more striking graphic, if I showed it, is how much of that is driven by prime-aged men, okay? We're seeing a real decline in prime-aged men in the labor force, okay? And that is a reason for concern, okay? Because that has, big implications for how families are doing and the ability to raise children and so forth. Okay, myth and misunderstanding number 3 is that rural America is not ethno-racially diverse, right? That rural America is basically white folks, okay? And indeed, some places it is, but a lot of places it's not, okay? So we're going to take a look at this. So one thing to recognize is that rural areas, non-metropolitan America, is more diverse than is commonly assumed. Okay? One thing to recognize is that this is not new, okay? Minoritized populations have lived on the land that we now understand to be rural America since before the birth of the nation, okay? This is certainly true for indigenous folks, right? Tribal people, okay, who have been around since time immemorial, right? We often have this idea of European immigrants, right, arriving on the eastern coast of what later became the United States and encountering a vast wilderness, right, with no inhabitants, right? That is not true, right? There were already folks there. Okay, so folks that we today think of as indigenous or Native American, but it's also true of black people. Okay, I mean, black people were central to the colonial process, especially in the southern United States where I live, right? Continue to this day to have very large rural black populations in the Deep South. Okay, in my state, for example, it's 1 out of every 3 people is black, and the places with the densest composition of black folks are actually in the northeastern Delta region, okay, which is rural. People that we think of as Hispanic or Latino today, right? I mean, it's important to recognize that Las Vegas, Los Angeles, those aren't Anglo words, right? So the Western United States, much of what is the Western United States today, right, was actually was colonized by Spain, later was part of Mexico, then later still became the United States, right? So borders have moved around, folks, as well as people moving themselves. In 2020, roughly a quarter, 1 out of every 4 people living in non-metro America was non-white, okay? So roughly 1 out of 4 folks living in rural America identified as Hispanic or black, Native American or Asian, okay, and mixed race. You can see what that. So you can see the pie chart that shows that in 2020, as well as where the real growth has been in the population by race and ethnicity since 1990. Right? If you look over that 2 decades of time, right? And the thing that should really stand out to you is sort of twofold, okay? One is all groups have shown population growth in non-metropolitan America, with the exception of one, and that is white people, right? And part of that is because the white population is aging, okay? And because fertility is lower than it used to be. Okay, people are having fewer kids, right? And the population is aging. So we're actually seeing the white population decreasing on balance in rural America, right? And all other groups increasing, especially, right, major growth in the Hispanic or Latino population in rural America. Okay. Now, where this is happening varies a lot, okay? So the rural population is becoming increasingly ethno-racially diverse, okay? And children are really the vanguard, right? Anytime you want to see population change, the thing to do is go to an elementary school, right? Because the kids in the elementary school are the future, right? And so children are really the vanguard of this process. If you look at the middle panel here, okay, this is the population in 1990, okay, and places that have darker colors have low diversity, okay, places that have more of the yellow color have greater diversity, okay, and of course one of the things that you can see really stand out in 1990 is the difference between the North and the South, right? If you're in the Southeast, really significant rural black populations. As you move towards the Southwest, much more significant Latino populations, as well as indigenous populations, right, in like eastern Oklahoma and the Four Corners region and so forth. Okay. But the other takeaway, if you look to the first panel over there, okay, that's the total population in 2020, okay? The big thing to notice, right, is that yellowish color, right, is becoming more dominant, and the blue region, places that are less diverse, is shrinking, okay? So rural America is really it's becoming significantly more diverse in terms of population over time. And then if we look over to this right panel, okay, this is looking at the ethno-racial makeup of kids, okay, people under 18 years of age, children and youth, okay, and the thing to really take away from there is that the diversity of children is even more widespread, okay? I mean, the only place that really stands out there is kind of central Appalachia, kind of eastern Kentucky, southern West Virginia, okay? The rest of the country, right, is becoming more ethno-racially diverse in rural areas. Okay, and that's a big change. Okay, another myth and misunderstanding is that rural America is healthier, right? That rural Americans, they have access to cleaner water, cleaner air, more fresh food, outdoor activities. It's a healthier place to be. Okay? The first thing that I want to bring your attention to is something that's called the rural mortality penalty. Okay? And this is something that my colleague Shannon Monnet has done a tremendous amount of work on. The rural mortality penalty is that when we look at age-adjusted death rates, and you got to do an age adjustment when you look at mortality, right? Because the older we get, the greater the odds are that we're going to pass. Okay, so there's different probabilities of having a mortality event as we age. Okay, so you age adjust mortality. Okay, and when we do that, age-adjusted death rates are consistently higher in non-metro counties. Okay, not only you can see that over on this side. It's a little. I guess those colors are not standing out for y'all. Okay, but non-metro is for both males and females. Okay, non-metro is higher. Is the upper line, and metro mortality rates is the bottom line. Okay, and thing to take away here is that not only is there a gap, but the gap is getting wider. Right, the gap is really been growing over time. Okay, between non-metro and metro places in terms of mortality rates. What this really suggests, okay, is people that are having really different life experiences, right? People that are having really, really different life experiences. I'm going to talk about reasons, kind of the causes of this, right? But if people are dying at greater rates, okay, it's because those life experiences are fundamentally different. The other thing to recognize is that COVID-19 wiped out decades of improvements, right? If you look at the peak there with mortality, right, how it jumped up across all settings when COVID-19 hit, right? A bunch of extra deaths. Okay, if you track those peaks back, right, you're talking about basically, like 25 years of improvements for men and almost 40 years of improvements for women, right, wiped out by that pandemic. Okay. When you hear people talk about the pandemic wasn't all that bad, right, don't believe the hype. Okay. The gap has been growing. That mortality gap has been growing over the last couple of decades, right? And the thing that's interesting about it is it's driven by nearly all causes of death. Nearly all causes of death are higher in non-metro counties compared to metropolitan ones, okay? So non-metro death rates are higher for cancer. They're higher for heart disease, for COVID-19, for transport accidents. Suicide is higher in non-metropolitan America. Alcohol-related death, higher in non-metropolitan America. So this would be things like cirrhosis, right? And of course, some of the cancer and heart disease is actually probably alcohol-induced, okay? But alcohol abuse, diabetes, okay? Chronic lower respiratory disease, stroke, and maternal mortality, right? Women dying in the birthing process. All of those things are higher in non-metropolitan than metropolitan areas, okay? And are driving that gap, okay? Again, if you look at these sort of, these issues, right? It's suggesting people that are having fundamentally different life experiences, right? And thus have, different degrees of longevity. So, and indeed, right, there at periods even with the overdose crisis, right, there have been periods, it's not true now, overdose deaths are higher in metropolitan areas, but we've had periods, right, where overdose has been a really big deal as well. A lot of this is also related to obesity, right, which is more pronounced in rural areas. Okay, myth and misunderstanding number 5. A rural revolt propelled the presidential elections of Donald Trump, right? This is the idea that rural areas, right, are the base of the MAGA movement, right? And that a revolt of rural people has really pushed the victories Trump had in 2016, right? And then again this past November. So I want to dig into that a little bit. Okay. One trend is, if we start on the far side of the slide, is that the non-metro vote has been trending Republican, but it's been trending Republican for decades. The Trump vote is not somehow off the general trend line. Okay? The last time metropolitan and non-metropolitan voters had similar preferences for presidential candidates, Democrat or Republican, was Jimmy Carter in 1976. Okay? That was the year I was born, and I'm going to go on a limb and say most of y'all were not born in 76, looking out at the crowd, okay? That was the last time that there was that basically metro and non-metro people were on the same page in their preferences, okay? Since that time, we've seen divergence. Okay, and the Trump vote is generally on the trend line. Okay, so that's the first thing to recognize, right? And then you can see the gap at the bottom, right? I mean, it goes basically from 0 in 76 to in 2024 about a 20-point difference in preference. Okay, which is not insignificant, of course. The other thing to recognize, though, if we think about this most recent election, okay, is that really what determined the election was not the rural vote. Okay? What determined the election was the absolute and utter collapse of the urban vote. Okay? Which has disproportionately gone over time to Democrats. Okay? People in the big cities, quite frankly, did not turn out for the election. And that's what determined it. Okay? So there's a lot of emphasis on rural America, okay? But the action in this election was actually in the cities. Okay? If you look at this map, right, you can see the blue and the blue difference is the difference in the number of votes that Kamala Harris got versus Joe Biden in 2020. Okay? And then the red is the difference between what Trump got in 2024 and 2020. Okay? There's a little bit of positivity there on the Trump side in some more rural areas, but we're not talking about many votes. The story is in those biggest cities. 5 million fewer votes in the biggest cities in this country. Okay? 3 million fewer votes in the major metro suburbs. Another 2 million fewer in the medium suburbs. Okay? It was a collapse of urban turnout that determined the election. Okay? And many of us have heard about this rural revolt right? The story was not a rural revolt. The story was urban people not voting for whatever reason. Okay, so just in conclusion here, and I'm getting the signal that I'm going to get the gong here in a minute. Okay, so just to sum this up, rural America is significant in its size and population share and social and economic significance. There's a lot of myths and misunderstandings about rural America, and part of that is because we live in a really urban-centric society, right? When people think about social change and social problems and progress on social problems, they think about urban places disproportionately, right? But social change abounds in rural America, and it's accompanied by new challenges for rural people and places. We need greater attention in terms of research and policy that really centers the rural American experience. And doing so will help better understand and serve not only rural Americans, but the nation as a whole. And I want to close with one other point here that's important, okay? And that is that a robust and accessible federal data infrastructure is really critical for supporting rural America. In this presentation, I drew on data from the U.S. Census Bureau, from the U.S. Department of Agriculture Economic Research Service, from the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, and from the CDC, okay? One of the things to know about this moment, and hopefully it's a passing moment, okay, is that a lot of our federal data is disappearing. It's being taken down, and it's being taken away from the American people, okay? I think we need to be concerned about a government that doesn't want to be transparent and doesn't want us to understand what our country looks like and the problems that we're facing, okay? It's something that everybody that cares about the country, right, should be paying attention to and really raising a fuss about, okay? Because we can't track how we're doing as a people, regardless of ideology, right? I mean, forget about political ideology. We can't see how we're doing as a people if federal data sources are disappearing. So I will leave it there and say thank you. If you, out front, I have cards. If you found this interesting, you want to check out our book, I'd welcome you to do that. I have cards out there that have further information, and I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Can rural areas come back in terms of their economies, like particularly here in upstate New York, which is a disaster, but there's more cryptocurrency mining, wind farms, alternative energy sources, and fracking? If you essentially legalize a lot of things which are kind of dicey.
Yeah, I mean, there's a variety of ways that we can stimulate rural economies.
I know that some of them are fracking. It's illegal in New York. Would you have to legalize it first?
Yeah, obviously, unless you want to have large-scale illegal fracking. You would. I mean, in my part of the country, right, I'm in an oil and gas part of the country, right, they frack like crazy, right, and there's, of course, downsides to that, right, so you have to, I think with any activity, you have to think about upsides and downsides, right, a lot of the horizontal drilling and injection processes and stuff are a threat to clean water, which is important to have as living beings. I mean, there's trade-offs is all I'm saying. I mean, the one thing is that I think that is perhaps hopeful in this political moment is that there has been a renewed emphasis on thinking about manufacturing, right, and thinking about domestic manufacturing capacity. Right? And thinking about the fact that, folks that don't have the privilege of going to a Hartwick or an LSU also need good jobs, right? That can allow them to pay a mortgage and raise their kids, right? And manufacturing is a sector that has historically done that in a way that lower wage service work or retail, it's often the case that those don't provide a lot in the way of sort of a ladder, right? So I think that the re-emphasis on manufacturing, I think there's a lot that we could do also with agriculture. I mean, the current way we approach agriculture is large scale, very capital, technologically intensive, right? But there's interest in other forms and other ways to produce food, right? And those tend to be more, to require more labor. I think there's opportunities there.
So the legalization of marijuana in all states that would be good for farmers, wouldn't it?
I mean, there's no doubt there's a market. I don't know. It's a little bit that's a little bit outside my area of expertise, right?
All right, that's how the game places back.
Yeah, no. I think it's a good question, and you know, one of the things is just for one opportunity is thinking about regional clusters of economic activity, right? So instead of pitting rural communities against each other to try to get that home run factory or whatever, right? To think about regional opportunities for growth, but you have to it has to be things that socially and culturally fit as well.
So we do have one more question.
Okay. So globally, total fertility rate has been declining, right? Particularly in post-industrialized nations. So when we talk about population loss in the context of metro versus non-metro areas, would you expect to see a difference in fertility rate between those two sectors, or is it pretty much the same?
No, it's different. Okay, so in non-metropolitan areas, the total fertility rate among women is higher in non-metro than metro context. But the difference is age. Okay, so women of childbearing age tend to have more children in rural context, but there's fewer women of childbearing age in rural America compared to metro. Okay, and obviously, if you're thinking about aging, you know, our population generally is aging in this country, and it's aging faster in rural places, right? So people age out of those childbearing years, obviously, right? I mean, there's sort of the social considerations of finishing school and getting jobs in certain careers, right? But you can run up the biological clock is real, right? So yeah, I mean, I think that's the basic answer. I mean, the other thing to recognize about that dynamic is that youth outmigration from rural areas is a big deal, right? So when young adults leave rural communities and go elsewhere, right, they sort of take their reproductive potential with them, right, and often start families other places.
Do we have any other questions? Looks like we've got two more. We'll take two more, and then we'll be done.
Hi, I'm from rural Maryland, and we have a couple of areas that are aging out because people in my age range are moving out and basically escaping because the more established members of the community are kind of refusing to let anything modernize. Like, they actually protested the renovation of a building that was a food service building that had pipes that were leaking in the kitchen, but they didn't want to have anything done to it because they didn't want anything to change. So do you have any ideas on how to, like, encourage a modernization that older generations would be more accepting to, because what we've been trying has not worked?
Yeah, I think that push and pull happens in a lot of places, and I'm going to be more diplomatic than I might have been a few years ago because I'm getting older. But you know, there's sort of two things, right? I mean, I'm sympathetic to wanting to maintain character and identity and custom and tradition. I think those things are important, but at the same time, places that don't change die, right? And so somewhere between no change and radical change is a sweet spot, right? And the people in a given community need to try to come together and find that. But you're right. I mean, if you have a community where everything is geared towards older folks and it's simply not attractive for younger people, you can't then sit around and wonder, where are the younger people? Why don't we have a little league anymore, right? Why do we got to consolidate our school? That sort of thing, right? And all of that being said, right, for most of it, change is hard, you know, but we have to find ways to sort of come together and find a way forward. So I would hope that in the case of your community, right, that younger folks could come to the fore, right, and come and engage with, the community council or the county commissioners, or right, and begin to have that conversation. Just be like, look, where you guys are coming from is valid, but understand where we're coming from. And if we're going to be here to make a home and raise families and be taxpayers and civic leaders and little league coaches, we need to have these sort of elements to do that, you know? So I think maybe trying to engage that dialogue. I would also think that the folks that you perceive as standing in the way of change might be a lot more open to that dialogue than you think. Because if they're raising their voices, it's because they care about the place, right?
So I have two questions. Do you see rural America coming back from the gap in deaths that was caused by COVID-19 in the coming decades? And two, do you foresee younger people moving to rural areas, and if so, for what reasons?
Yeah, so, I mean, the mortality trend related to COVID, we will see as the new data comes out. I'm fairly certain, it'll come back down from that peak. I don't know if we'll see that gap close or not. There's a number of factors actually working against that potentiality. So, for example, there's a lot of discussion about making major Medicaid cuts as a way to, if you look at our federal budget in this country, right, it's primarily Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, defense, and interest on the debt. That's like 85% of the pie, right? And everything that we argue about is the other 15%. Okay, so there's a lot of discussion about cutting, in current Congress, cutting Medicaid. Well, the problem is for rural America is rural Americans rely more on Medicaid for their health insurance than metropolitan populations do, right? I looked it up before I came in here. The population in this county, 1 out of every 3 people in this county is on Medicaid, right? So it's a major deal, right? And so if you take that away and you're talking about folks that don't get health insurance through their employers, right? Then you're in a situation where people simply don't engage in preventive care and don't do those sort of things until they have to go to the ER, or they have symptoms that are manifesting, right, which turn out to reveal that they're really quite ill, right? Things that you could have caught. And I think that there's the other thing that we really have to keep an eye on in rural America is obesity, right? We have to find ways. To encourage people to be more active and eat differently, because it's a big deal, especially for kids, right? Because anybody that's past 45 can tell you, right? Your ability to get it off, right? It slows down, like your metabolism slows down a lot, and it becomes harder and harder as you get older. In terms of what will get people back, I think there's lots of opportunities. The reality is that people like rural context. They like to get out of the rat race. People like nature, right? I mean, we have an anxiety epidemic in this country, right? Think about if people, get a little bit away from their cell phones and get in the woods, right? That can be a really healing thing. I just saw a lot of eyes roll when I say get away from your cell phones, right? but it's true, and so I think that the point is technological innovations that are leading people to be able to separate where they work and where they live, right? I think that's a real opening for rural America, because a lot of people would like to live in rural contexts, raise their children in rural contexts, right? But they can only do that if they can also get a job that allows them to pay their bills.
I believe that is time. If you all have any other questions, please direct them to slack@lsu.edu. Flood his email, please, as if he doesn't have any other emails to answer to. Thank you so much for coming. If you all were not able to sign the sign-in sheets, they are right outside the door. We will be around at least for a little bit, so if you all have any questions, please come up. Thank you.